Greetings, Earthlings and humanoids. Welcome to episode 19, Climate Change and Capitalism. This is our course on philosophy of climate change. This is our last lecture in our unit, our module on theories of climate politics or climate science and context. We haven't talked about economics as a science and the economy itself as a way of theorizing climate change. So that's what we're going to do today. New feature, Akbar wonders. Akbar wonders about a lot of things. He thinks Earth is a curious place. Today he's wondering, can we keep living like this? Just as a symbol, a totem of our way of life, the plastic grocery bag, right? Is this crazy that we're doing this? Are we going to find a way to keep up this consumerism in this increasing productivity, which I think are the essence of capitalism, what we'll get to today? In some ways, climate change is really a gamble we're taking on the future of capitalism. So today I just kind of want to open these big questions, this big picture perspective. And then in the next module, this is going to be some necessary background as we dig a little bit more into the specifics of climate policies. Okay, so today, like I said, I want to examine climate change from the standpoint of economics. I mean, this is like many of these topics, this could be an entire course or a degree, devoted to this. So we'll only be able to hit some highlights. And I want to survey some views on capitalism and climate change. So I'm going to do a historical perspective on this primarily, and I'm going to start about 400 years ago and say that something happened. And that something is capitalism. And that climate change is really an unintended consequence of capitalism. And capitalism, again, in its essence, is about growth, I think, growing productivity and consumption. That raises the question, which is the $6 million question: can a finite planet sustain this kind of economic system? So we're going to go through one response of no. So we need systemic structural change, and one response of yeah, if we get the externalities right. So we'll end sort of on that note. Okay, so let's start. This is fascinating. You know, I really like Our World in Data, and I have this linked in your notes. This is not time on the x-axis, it's population, and it starts. So time you follow as you go along this line, and it starts just before the Black Plague in Great Britain, which wiped out almost half of the population. And so as you look at this, you're looking from 1280 to about 1780 or so. And you notice for the vast majority of this time, GDP or GDP per capita is relatively flat. And they call this the Malthusian or the zero-sum economy. If I get more, you get less. If you get more, I get less. And there's this kind of trap where it's a zero-sum game. There's only so much to go around, so many resources. That was the state of the economy, insofar as an economy even existed, up until really relatively recently in the history of humanity. We're talking beginning 400 years ago, this changed. And remember, we've been around for 200,000 years. And something like a steady state was the rule. And it's only in the last 400 years something changed. Here, remember the Great Acceleration? How about this one? Look at the last 2,000 years. This is inflation adjusted. Something massive happened, and whammo, all of a sudden and very recently, there's been this enormous growth. Now GDP, gross domestic product, there's P, productivity, right, as one indicator of the economy, just took off. One example, right, just to try to make this a little more concrete. Look at this. Capitalism is also about innovation, right? From scribes to early printing presses to steam-powered printing to now the internet, the ability to produce a number of books per day goes up and up and up and then starts to grow exponentially. Of course, it's not just books, right? This is a look at some key industries in England. Again, this is all linked on that same link in your notes. And note, the scale here is logarithmic. So all of these things, you know, even, oh my gosh, I was thinking Akbar himself, look, the plastic toy, where the heck does this come from? And they churn these out probably, no offense, Akbar, but my gosh, 5,000 in a minute or something crazy, right? That's capitalism. That's the world we live in. So what do we mean by that? So if capitalism is what happened, I want to tell you, I mean, a lot of people say, well, historically, Adam Smith is the go-to person in The Wealth of Nations on capitalism. Well, let me give you my version from John Locke, who was writing about 100 years before Smith. And I'll just try to kind of analyze what I think the key points about capitalism are. Look, Locke was saying we're on this earth in order to increase, to grow. His word was increase. And the first part of his story, really, and I think this is maybe the foundations of capitalism, is you first have to look at the earth as capital, right? You have to see things as natural resources. They are potential. And until they're utilized by human ingenuity and labor power, they're actually wasted. And a side story here, this is a big part of the justification for colonialism, is that native peoples were wasting these potential resources by not enclosing them, in cultivating them, and then creating industries on the basis of them, right? That could be a whole nother thing, but I think that's a key part of capitalism and its tight relations to colonialism. At the essence then of capitalism is human labor. Locke says the key to breaking that zero-sum game is not in nature. Nature is limited, but it's in our labor power. Once I mix my labor with something, I start to increase its value and I can start to increase its productivity. So labor, capitalism is a story about labor and labor power, and it's about this laboring class that was expropriated, as in the commons was taken away and enclosed into private enclosures. That meant the vast majority of people were left kind of naked on the now newly created market as this laboring class. And all they really possessed was their labor power, right? That they then would have to sell on the market in return for a wage. So you have the development of a wage-based economy. All of this, I think, is part of capitalism. Labor also becomes divided in a way it couldn't be when it was in a sort of cottage-based, household-based, master-apprentice-based economy. Now you can get labor divided, and this is where Adam Smith is probably better, talking about how that leads to massive increases in productivity. And then, of course, post-Locke and post-Smith, as you get into 19th, 20th century, you get labor now mechanized with big machines, steam-powered at first, right? And then high energy, fossil fuels in particular. And all of this labor power leads to, again, the key, growing productivity. This is also innovation. And of course, the capitalists see this in terms of profit as the driving power. And again, profit really is just the product of surplus labor. You know, you use the laboring class, you have to pay them enough to sort of reproduce themselves and feed themselves, but then you sort of take off the top, and that's profit. That's the profit motive, which again, we have to mention as a key part of capitalism. And then you have this need, I think, growing needs for growing consumption. So you innovate more, you produce more, you actually flip the script, you know, in the old way of saying, let's say in the zero-sum game, necessity is the mother of invention. Well, once capitalism starts taking off, invention becomes the mother of necessity, right? We invent the computer, and then lo and behold, entire ways of life come to depend on the computer, right? So this consumption grows along, and needs grow along with productivity. Now, a key part here, what is the role of government? John Locke's story is government is there to protect the growing private property and wealth of especially the industrious few who are really good capitalists. That's the purpose of government, right? To manage a growing economy and protect the property interests of those who are really good at this whole productivity game. Now, inequality results, he says, and we know, but inequality in wealth And property is justified because everyone is better off. And Locke says, and Smith, they both say something like, even a poor person in an industrial society is better off than the king of a so-called savage land. Why is that? Well, because the capitalists, even if they're totally selfish, they can't help but have this overflowing wealth and productivity, and they need people to buy their products. And so as we do this, our material prosperity increases, and so kind of everybody's boat is lifted. There, how's that? That's a theory of what capitalism is. That's what happened. Okay. Remember, is it the Anthropocene we're in, or is it the capital scene? Is it humans who are having an impact on the planet, or is it certain kinds of humans? And I think there's a really strong case to be made. It's really certain kinds of humans. And then you say, what kind of human? Capitalists, right? And why is that? Well, because they're hitched to the system of growing productivity and consumption. But wait, okay, John Locke was writing when there was such a thing as, quote unquote, the new world, right? Which was empty, okay? So he had all these assumptions about, well, you can enclose private property and there'll be enough left for everybody else. But we know better now. The earth is finite. So can we sustain a system premised on growth? That is the, what did I say, $6 million question, right? Well, in other words, what's at stake is this Lockean proviso. Locke said that when I enclose a piece of property and claim it as my own, which, by the way, my body is my origin of private property. And then when I enclose something and I work on it with my body, it becomes also private property. It's a really interesting theory of property, a labor theory of property. When I enclose it, there's still enough and good left for other people. So there's nevertheless left for others because I enclose it for myself. So he that leaves as much as another can make use of does as good as take nothing at all, he says. And this is the case with land and water. There's so much of it. Well, thanks to the success of the very system he created, now there's not so much of it, right? So here we are. The question about capitalism and the environment, capitalism and climate change, is can we sustain this basic formula, this basic system, when it's becoming perhaps a victim of its own success because it's grown so big that maybe its excesses are going to catch up with it and undermine it, right? That's the big question. Now, I'm going to give you two perspectives. I'm putting Naomi Klein's book here and I link to it, but I don't necessarily want to say I'm representing her in particular. She's just kind of a symbol of one way of thinking about capitalism is it is the problem. In other words, Locke's formula can't work indefinitely. It cannot work in the 21st century when we've got, what, 7.3 billion people on the planet and they're consuming so many resources. So we need radical, systemic restructuring of our economic system. By the way, this word neoliberalism gets tossed around a lot. I would say Locke is like liberalism, okay? That's the liberal capitalism. Neo is maybe a post-Cold War or post-World War II global consensus around this free market ideology. So it's really Lockean liberal capitalism juiced up and entrenched in nation states that then are seeking to globalize capitalism. And this is also, you could say, kind of neo-colonialism, because it's a race to the bottom for cheap labor in a way that keeps the imperative of growth going. Okay, enough on that. So the problem with capitalism, lots of them, right? Hierarchy, massive inequalities, wealth concentrates at the top, all of the burdens concentrate at the bottom. It has this metaphysics of individualism where we all think we're our own cowboy out on the free range, but it's just not true and it's not healthy. The working class around the world gets exploited. And we know this falls disproportionately on certain populations and others disproportionately get the benefits. So it's just systematically unfair. Consumerism just is a problem because we keep having our ideal of who we are, our identity, is this kind of bottomless pit of needs that we need somebody else, some corporation to fill for us. That's not good. So at the end of the day, degrowth, right? We need less production, less consumption, less trade, less travel. We got to live within our footprint. Okay, so that's one view. And again, that's not necessarily Klein's, but that's a view of capitalism as the problem. Now, here come the eco-modernists. And I think they would say basically Locke's formula is right. It still works, even on a quote unquote full planet. Why does it work? Because of this idea of decoupling. Again, Locke's story is just that we're really smart and we can use the labor of our hands, the work of our bodies, as informed by our minds, to transform the world from a kind of dangerous wasteland into something more suitable for our prospering, right? And even as we get better and better at that, and the planet starts to fill up and we have pollution problems, we still use the same formula to solve those problems. So we've talked about this before. The solution to the problems caused by innovation, caused by capitalism, is more innovation. It's more capitalism. It might need to be refined, of course, right? But you don't throw the whole system out. So one way to put this is Roger Pielke's iron law, and I put this in your notes. Oh, he says, so you think we need to sacrifice? No more ice water. Stop building strip malls and housing subdivisions, right? We've got to change our way of life. Capitalism is the problem, you think? No, it can't be, actually. It can't be because people just won't allow it to be the problem. So when you give people a choice between economic objectives and environmental ones, and they're in opposition, everybody choose economics. No politician is going to sacrifice economic growth, economic policy to environmental policy. So what does that mean? If you want to solve climate change, you have to solve it within the framework of capitalism. It's got to be from within the framework of this imperative of growth. Because anything else, anybody who says, oh, stop serving ice water and we're going to have to degrow and people are going to have less material prosperity, it's dead on arrival. It's utopian, it's foolish, it's unrealistic, it's a waste of time. Okay, however you want to put it. The Overton window we'll talk about next time. By the way, and this we'll talk about later too, even the so-called radical Greens, maybe like Naomi Klein, they know this, right? More on that later though. Okay, so if we have to solve it within climate change within the context of capitalism, the challenge really is to make sure that we account for the true costs, or what's called the social costs of carbon. The problem then, from this viewpoint, is that the true costs of carbon aren't built into the actual price at the gas pump or on your utility bill, or the carbon that's embodied into material products that we buy, like those plastic bags, right? So then the challenge is just to figure out what are those real costs, what are the actual social costs of carbon, and internalize them in the price so that you tweak consumer behavior, market behaviors. And by the way, the market is where the vast majority of decisions are made. That's why we need to look at economics as a theory of climate politics, because so much of our decisions are on this market. Of course, it's a market regulated and structured by government rules, but nonetheless, they're more or less free decisions being made here. So we have to align those decisions with our climate objectives, and the great aligner is price. You've got to build the right cost into the price. That's the whole game. I've put here subsidies as a major problem in this little graphic of the tank, because look, so much of our military industrial complex is really about oil, isn't it? Right? So, but do we actually pay the cost of wars at all, let alone at the gas pump? No, right? So this is an IMF report, which I put in your notes. We've got to fix those subsidies. Okay, that's one way to build, is to get rid of those externalities and build the actual price, actual cost into the price, because then people will change. Then you'll decarbonize the economy. Now, side note, maybe the tragedy here is, if you think capitalism really is the problem, maybe we're stuck between what the economic and political realities will allow. In other words, there is this iron law of climate change. We're not going to sacrifice economic growth. But on the other hand, there's just physical demands. In other words, Physics of climate change demands that we pay massive costs for carbon, but the economic and political realities won't allow us to do that. And that's why we're going to hit a wall and collapse. Maybe. Okay, so that's just one tragic story you could tell. But whether we're stuck in that or not, if we think we've got to work within the confines of capitalism, then it's not like, oh, we solved it. Okay, now you're saying, well, what do we specifically need to do? How do we balance different priorities? How do we find the real costs? How do we build them in? What are the right policy mechanisms? And for all those reasons, now we need to go to our next module on the specifics of climate policies. So I'll end there. This is Akbar's quote. He is a history buff. A little bit on John Locke. Did you know that his famous second treatise was, when he was writing it, it was in a journal that he disguised with the label El Morbo Gallico, which means the French disease. And I'll leave that up to you if you want to go digging around and figure out why did he do that. Okay, enough from us. Next time we'll jump into a new module. Until then, may the force be with you.